Good afternoon. Hope everybody enjoyed their lunch. Thanks, Becky. We'll dive right in here. So I'm Jake Hawkins. I'm the Fire Prevention Officer with the municipality. And this is, as Becky said, this is Jeff Andross, the Chief Building Official. I'm going to hand that to you, Jeff. That's 4 there. Okay. Here, go ahead. Okay.
Hello, I'm Jeff Andross, CBO from the Township of Severn. I've been with the township 25 years, so a lot of you people probably recognize my face. I'm not sure if that's good or bad, but we'll continue with that anyway. We're going to talk a little bit about the building code and how farm buildings relate to the building code, and Jake will talk a little bit about the fire code. Where the building department kind of fits in is, where the building department fits in with construction, as Katie had said, is after the zoning part has been completed and you have all your approvals and stuff, that's where we step in and we do the building stuff. So we do your plans and that kind of thing. Like Katie and others have said, the planning is the most important part of, of all this. Making sure you have everything that you need to move forward, because it's frustrating and time consuming if you think you're in a place and you're not there and you need to kind of get more information or come back to the township. So if you have everything in order to get things moving, it'll be a lot easier for you. In terms of the building code, in this aspect of it, it can be difficult when you're trying to take a building from one use to another use, and the change is generally more difficult because you're going from less of a use to maybe a more intense use, whereas you might have a barn that you're going to change into a venue that people are going to be attending on a regular basis. So now you have safety concerns and potentially building concerns. We're going to go through a few topics here, and then Jake will go through a few of the fire topics. New construction versus existing construction. New farm construction is regulated by the Ontario Building Code Part 2. That's new in the building code, and that deals with farm buildings that are meant to be used as farm buildings. Agricultural use, that kind of thing, low occupancy. SB 11 would deal with a smaller farm building if you had the same situation. It's an agricultural use, low occupancy. Existing construction may, depending on the required renovation or construction, be designed under Part 10 or Part 11 under the Ontario Building Code. Additional construction may be subject to Part 3 or Part 9. What that means is if you have an existing building and you want to use it for a different use, there is avenues that you can get there. So Part 10 and 11 deals with existing buildings that you're going to renovate, or perhaps an existing building that doesn't need a renovation. So the use that you have now to the second use that you want to use it for, they don't change a lot. So that means that the building might be suitable for a different use. That doesn't happen very often. Usually you get into Part 11, which is talking about renovations, and it gives you options to use the building as it is with some kind of compliance alternatives, which would potentially be safety items, lighting items, barrier-free items. So those are the parts there. Part 3 and 9, they deal with large and small buildings, and you could be part of that too. There's a lot of different pathways through the building code, which makes it difficult, and that kind of touches on the next part here. Plans and designs. To convert a barn or farm building to a different use, the required plans and design will generally require them to be completed by a professional engineer or professional architect. The reason for that is if you want to have a building that is a barn from 60 years ago or 70 years ago, and now you're going to bring 100 people in for events and that kind of thing, the barn probably wasn't built for that design, strength-wise, access-wise, egress-wise, that kind of thing. You would need a person, like an architect or an engineer, to potentially design you all those kind of components. Structural being one of them. Is the barn in any kind of structural way suitable for what you're going to do going forward? That touches on the next point. A professional assessment will also include the required life safety requirements within the building, emergency lighting, signs, egress. I touched on that a bit. Jake will maybe touch on that a little bit farther. The second you start using this building for those purposes, people need to safely get in and out of them. And, depending on the use, that you might be bringing in other factors. You might be cooking things. You might want to have different lighting, that kind of thing. All that kind of stuff, will be part of the design. And we'll go a little farther here, I think, this next one. Barrier-free design. Barrier-free design is very important. It's not always easy to implement into an existing building because there's a lot of factors, but it's obviously very important for the safety and comfort of anybody using the building, that they can get in safely and out. Sometimes we forget about lots of other disabilities because we may not have them, but it touches on pretty much all kinds of different issues that a person could have in the building, during the use of the building, and in the event of an emergency, getting out of the building. A couple of the items there are just examples of things that you might have to consider. Entrances, making sure they're accessible, the doors, the sizes of doors, ramps if you have a difference in elevation, handrails, potentially power door openers, so a person could get in with a wheelchair if they need to, or if they couldn't handle using the door, they would have the opportunity for the door to open themselves. Washrooms, door sizes, room sizes, grab bars, and power door openers is there twice for some reason. Another major consideration that we have, and we were talking about this with a fellow at lunch there, is the requirement for water and wastewater. If you have a business that's going to use a lot of water and it's on your property that you probably didn't anticipate that you were going to use this much water when the well was put in, that could affect down the road how much water you have for your business or for the house or whatever's on the property. Sewage systems is interesting because most properties would not have a sewage system that was designed for commercial use. They wouldn't. They're designed entirely differently for commercial use than they are residential. There's a lot of factors that are taken in, including the number of people. This would include employees. It's the number of people, it's the area of the building, it's the use of the building. It's a bit of a complicated calculation to come up with, but I would suspect that anybody that was having a business on their property, the sewage system would not be designed for that. When you design the septic system, you have to take into account all the flows that you generate. That would be the house, that would be the business, that would be multiple potential different businesses. You use the highest flow. So if you have one day that you have an extremely high flow, well, then that's what you design your septic system for. If you had a business where you were just doing things on Sundays or something, unfortunately, that's what you size the septic system for, which makes the septic system usually quite large. Another option is portable washrooms. That is an option that we see that people, they have businesses and they don't want to create actual washrooms and they don't want to rebuild the sewage system, so they go with a portable washrooms, and that can be an option. Other considerations, heating and cooling and ventilation requirements. A lot of these businesses are seasonal, some aren't. You would want to consider heating and cooling and ventilation for the comfort of whoever's in your business, as well as the building itself. You know, cranking the heat up and down in a building isn't great for it. Cooking appliances, Jake may or may not talk about that a little bit, but you'll want to consider that as well. You may need exhaust for any kind of cooking. Year-round use or seasonal use, we touched on that a bit. Other approvals are important. Before you get to the building stage, you'll want to make sure that you have MTO approval. You'll need zoning approval like Katie talked about. Health unit, and potentially through the Ministry of Environment, based on the septic system. Ministry of Environment deals with any properties that are over 10,000 liters a day. So if your design says it's over 10,000 liters a day, it's over 10,000 liters a day, you would go to the ministry. That doesn't necessarily mean you would generate 10,000 liters a day, but that would be your design that sends you to the ministry. Another topic is tents, temporary tents. People put up tents. You would need a building permit for a tent. If you're going to have an event, you would get a building permit. And sometimes, depending on the size of the tent, you might need an engineer to certify the tent. If it's a large tent, we have to make sure that the wind isn't going to carry it away, it's not going to fall on 200 people, that kind of thing. So when you get into large tents, then you need an engineer, and the engineer needs to sign off the installation of the tent. Food trucks, we also require permits for food trucks. You can't just pull it up onto your yard and start a business of a food truck. You need a permit through the town, and you also need to deal with some of those other things, water, washroom, health unit kind of things. Another item is signs, which isn't on there. If you want to put a sign up for your business, you may need a building permit. We do have smaller signs that don't require building permits, but if you get into a larger sign, you would potentially need a building permit. And we also have some zoning requirements that you need to meet for the locations of the signs and that kind of thing. Okay, I'm going to leave it with Jake here now.
Thanks, Jeff. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the fire code side of it. So under the Ontario Fire Code, they added this section called retrofit. So you're probably wondering, like, why is there an Ontario Building Code? Why is there this fire code section called retrofit? So the idea was you had these buildings that were built, some of them a long time ago. They wanted to increase the fire and life safety aspects of the building. So the idea was, great example is a church. You have a 150-year-old church. If you go into them now, most of them will have things like alarm systems. That's under retrofit. So they wanted to bring up the level of safety, right? So some of these older structures, you want to change the structure into something else. Maybe you're already using it for something else. Retrofit may apply, right? Very case-by-case basis. But when you think about a space and the use, so for example, this room, right? So we're in an assembly space, everybody's meeting up in this room. You've got, alarm system components, you've got emergency lighting and exit signage and all these things in this room, right? Fire extinguishers. If you're doing what we're doing in this room, in your building, and it doesn't have these things, it probably needs them, right? Pretty easy to kind of grasp the basics. So it's concern for fire department, it's always how we're going to get into a site, how we're going to help everybody if there's an emergency, right? Sometimes individuals are great about this. They'll get ahead of it and have a plan ahead of time. You might already have a road, for instance, that goes all the way through your property. Maybe you drive your large farm equipment on that road right now. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be good enough for what we need to do with it if there was an emergency, right? So pretty easy to think about an ambulance. Fairly light. If you can drive your pickup truck into a location, you can probably get the ambulance in there. But if we got to bring in a fire truck that needs to pump water, and we need to bring in a tanker truck to carry water, maybe we need to bring in 6 tanker trucks to carry water to fight a fire on your property, how are we getting in there to do the job, right? So there's actually some design things that come into that, and it depends on whether or not you actually need it, depends on the use, right? So when you're thinking about your property and what you want to do with it in the future, A great way to think about this is everybody knows building a road is expensive, right? So if you're going to build your building at the front of your property, I want to have people in to look at my product. I want to build my building. I want to put it at the front of my property versus the back of my property. What's the cost difference going to be for that access route, right? It might be, you look at your property and go, yeah, it would be nice if it was way back in the woods in the back of my property, have a nice little scenic area, but then imagine the cost of building that access route if it's required, right? So just something to think about when you're doing that consultation, and talking with planning and things like that. You might want to consider, they might say, oh great, we'll loop around a road right around, come back this way. Depending on the consultant, they may be great about telling you, every foot you add to this is going to be more money, but some may not say that, right? So just keep that in mind, right? And even now, with the properties you have, can we get in and do the job, right? Even without even considering changes. If we had a medical incident on your property and we had to get to the back of it, can we even do that right now, right? So I brought some information with me, I put it on the table. So we always take wildland fire mitigation seriously. It's a hot topic with what happened in Jasper and LA and some of these bigger wildfires. So there's actually some information on the table there for some best practices. One thing I find, people are pretty good about clearing up around their home. They'll pick up the dead brush, they'll cut the grass, things like that. But the rest of their property, you might have a field that's overgrown, you might have an old building that's maybe partially collapsed and it's all overgrown with vines and trees and everything. That's all fuel, right? So there's some best practices in there if anybody wants to have a look at the information. Kind of get an idea what we can do to mitigate some of that. One thing I frequently find is getting into a property is your route to get to the thing we want to save in danger of being on fire itself. And what I mean by that is you have the long windy road with all the trees overhanging it. If that's on fire, I can't drive through that to get to your house. I got to put that out first. So when you're thinking about the design of your property and what you can do to mitigate some of that, it's just something to consider, right? Severn Township does have an open air burning bylaw. I brought some of that information with me as well. So the idea there is you need to know how to responsibly burn. We want to work with you on that process. So, the little campfire in the backyard, you get your burn permit, you have your campfire, that's not really the stuff we're going to talk about in this forum. It's a pretty simple system to understand. It's the larger agricultural burns. If you want to clear your property and burn that material, then that's something we want to talk about, right? We want to work with you on that process and paying attention to the fire danger ratings. So you want to do some X, Y, Z on your property. Part of that's going to be having fires. We want to talk to you about that process, right? A great example is something like a Winterfest. You want to have a winter carnival or something like that. You want to put burn barrels out to keep everybody's hands warm. Well, they have a plan for all of those kinds of things, right? That's all stuff we want to talk about with the fire department to make sure that we're doing it safely and effectively, right? So emergency planning, in my mind, it's kind of a, toot your own horn kind of piece. I think everybody should have a base level emergency plan regardless. Whether or not you need it or are mandated by a code or an act to have it, I think you should take it seriously from the get-go, right? So touching on some of the previous points, if I can't get the ambulance in to your property, right, I can't do the job. If I can't get the fire truck in there, I can't do the job. So do you have any kind of planning already in place? If something was to happen, what are we gonna do, right? So as you get into more and more complex situations, the requirements become greater. There's more and more mandated. So for instance, like a building like this, there's actually a fire safety plan. There's a document that's like a guidebook for fire and life safety, tells the building occupants their responsibilities and tells us how to do stuff in the building. So for example, it tells me where the electrical panel is, or it tells me where I would expect the people to be. What are the accesses like, things like that. So when you develop your buildings, just keep in mind that at some point you're gonna trigger the requirement for that. And it's kind of an interesting process because you can take it on yourself, but you might find it too overwhelming, and some people will have to hire a third party to do it for you, right? A consultant. Great idea if you're looking at a larger venue is maybe touch base with somebody else that has one and see what they had to go through to get it, because we could start that process with you at really any point. We might have to modify the document along the way, but there's no reason not to start it if you're seriously looking at doing that task, right? So I want to convert this building to this. It's going to trigger this planning requirement to have this emergency planning stuff done. Contact us. We'll start working on you with it and show you how that process is going to work. So we're not doing it at the last minute because you need it to operate. So the idea is this plan's reviewed, approved, and in place before you start using the facility for that thing, right? So we got to be very cognizant of that we don't get too far down the line and then all of a sudden you got to do this and it's too much for you to handle. So you hire a consultant and they tell you it's going to be 8 weeks and now you're delayed, right? So try and front load a little bit. Happy to talk about it if you want to give me a call. So before we dive into the questions piece of it, I don't know about everybody else in the room, but I like examples of things. When I read slides, it maybe doesn't all settle in exactly in that process, right? So to kind of walk you through it, we'll do a hypothetical example, maybe something that we don't have in the municipality. So you have a 100-acre property. Let's say it's half woods, half field. You have a dirt bike. You drive your dirt bike around your property. It doesn't require any of this stuff to do that, right? You don't need site plan agreement. You don't need emergency planning. You might want to think about, can you get an ambulance in here if you crash your dirt bike, right? So then you decide, well, I'm going to make a dirt bike track. I'll make some ramps, invite my buddy over and do that. Well, you still don't necessarily require these things, right? So then maybe you go a little further. Now you have a couple buddies over with RVs and they're staying the weekend, okay? Well, you probably want to start taking some of the emergency planning stuff seriously. So you see your old barn that you've got on your property. Well, maybe I want to start bringing the bikes in there and working on them. Or maybe we'll rent this out and we'll have, 20, 30, 40 people over. And you can see like a progression, right? So if you get to the point where, you're putting up a tent, you're going to have a motocross event, and it's like, I'm going to have 100 people here. Maybe they're sleeping on site. Maybe they're gathering inside one of the buildings. You get to a point where you start to trigger more and more and more, right? So the idea in my mind is I like to know early in the process so we can help you. From the fire department's perspective, we'd rather say, how do we do this, than say no. So if you have, you have the dream, this is what we want to do. Well, give us a call. How can we get there? I'm more than happy to advise on, here's the steps that we're going to have to take to get you where you need to be. Because ultimately what we don't want is to come out and you're already doing the thing, and then we have to say, well, this isn't being done in a safe way. We're going to have to get other things done to do that. It would be no different than this room. If we walked in here today and the fire alarm system wasn't working, well, that's pretty hard to justify having everyone in the building without a plan in place to deal with that, right? So same thing, if you are stepping up your operations, then don't be afraid to make that call, right? There's certainly lots of different uses in the municipality, lots of unique circumstances and situations. It's an interesting piece because you could talk all day about everybody's specific thing they want to do, right? So we don't want to get too deep in the weeds on that piece of it, because there's no specific, one-page cheat sheet in the code that just magically tells you what you need. You have to kind of jump around all over the place, so you're going to need help to do that, right? So if you think about it like this, if you are going to do something on your property, obviously if you were there and you're kind of standing there, you're watching this thing happen, and you think to yourself, oh, if the fire department showed up, they wouldn't be able to put this fire out. Well, right away we've gone too far. We needed to deal with that ahead of time. Or if any other emergency, right? If any other emergency took place, can we do the thing we need to do to help you, right? Because that's ultimately what it's about. We want to protect people. We want to protect property, right? So take it seriously, and certainly don't be afraid to reach out. Like I said, we're more than happy to kind of work with you on the process and kind of feel it out. And even if you have a bunch of different ideas, you can always kind of go, well, if I do this or this, are they the same kind of requirements, or is one more than the other, or things like that, right? Obviously, hiring like Katie was touched on as well, hiring a consultant, yeah, that's a great idea. They can give you that professional advice piece on what's going to be required, but sometimes you just want to know ahead of time, right? Like you want to, hey, should I even think about doing this thing, or is it going to be so much that I don't want to take it on, right? So certainly the door is open, and don't be afraid to ask, right? So any questions on fire code, building code related items at all?
One for Jeff. With building code on agricultural buildings, is there a size limit on building where you don't need engineer to stamp it, or is there not?
Well, it can depend. 600 square meters is kind of the number that they use. because that takes it from potentially a Part 9 to a Part 3 building. But there can be other factors. If you're building it for a barn, it's a lot easier than if you're building it for another use. Because if you're building it for another use, then it might be sized as a Part 9 smaller building, but it will take you to Part 3 for barrier-free kind of things, fire separations potentially, that kind of thing, emergency lighting. So if it's a barn, 600 square meters is kind of the magic number. Yeah, yeah.
And a really good way to think about that is if you're going to build a building, think about everything you're ever going to want to do in that building and design it for that. Don't design a pole barn and then, it's just going to store hay, but I'm going to do all these other things down the road, and now all of a sudden you got to put an alarm system in it or exit doors and so on, right? So try and get with the most requirements first, and then you can work your way backwards, right? Good.
So is consulting the fire kind of the first step before you go to the building process currently? Because if you want to put up a building and say you don't have fire flow in your property, or your property don't have water being asked for the surveyor, and you need kind of fire's approval before you go to the building permit, would you recommend going fire first and then going, spending a whole bunch of money to get all the drawings?
It's going to start with planning. So if you took any particular chunk of property, if you're not allowed to do the thing you're trying to do on that property, then the other pieces aren't going to fall into place, right? So if you're in downtown Coldwater and you're not allowed to have a chemical factory downtown Coldwater, then, if planning said you can't build your chemical factory here, you're not going to bother doing design and asking fire about the requirements, right? But that being said, certainly happy to field questions on it if you're kind of feeling it out, right? So if you're thinking about something, for that 5-minute phone call, I certainly don't mind going through it with you to kind of give you an idea of some of the stuff that will be required on our side of it. The thing is, too, a lot of the time your plan will change as you work through the process with your consultant. So you might have this, I want to build a conference center. I want to build a whatever. You get into it with your consultant and you find the requirements. You might adjust that plan. And it might not be a huge adjustment, but we don't want to give you the kind of package for this, and then you've adjusted it to this, and now we got to kind of change everything we've told you, right? Because there's going to be different requirements for different things, right? If that makes sense. So certainly, it can be a lot to take on when you're kind of looking at it, because we don't expect a community member to be an expert on building code, an expert on fire code, an expert on planning act, and et cetera, right? So we want to rely on the subject matter experts to get the right information to you. But yeah, certainly, if you think that the planning piece is going to do what you want to do, the building piece is probably going to do what you want to do, it doesn't hurt at all to make the call and see what we have to say, right? Any other questions? Okay. Thank you.